There are moments you never forget, especially the ones that hit without warning. Mine began with a sentence that slammed into me before I could even breathe. My name is Erin, and this story starts with something my sister said to my face. You're banned from my wedding. She delivered it as if she were announcing a rule everyone should already know, then followed it with a sneer that cut deeper than the words themselves. I don't want anyone thinking my wedding looks like a discount sale. She made sure to glance at my supermarket badge in a way that told me exactly what she meant and exactly who she thought I was compared to her. I tried to understand how my own family had reached a point where my presence was treated like a flaw instead of support. My mom backed her up without hesitation, and even though I had seen that pattern my whole life, something about the silence that followed made the moment land harder than I expected. The part none of them bothered to acknowledge was simple. Every major payment tied to that wedding had my name on the billing line. I was the one who stepped in when costs spun out of control, the one who covered deposits. They could not manage the one who quietly kept everything moving each time the planning wobbled. She had no idea her wedding was about to get a real discount of its own. If you want to know how everything unraveled after that moment, and why I made the choice that changed all of our lives, stay with me until the end. I promise the rest of this story is worth hearing. I was born in Ohio, a place where my earliest memories were shaped by routines that taught me more about resilience than excitement. My father carried a quiet dignity that never required explanation, and even as a child I sensed the weight behind the decisions he made. He believed responsibility was not something people performed for recognition, but something they carried because it defined who they were, long before the world tried to label them. His expectations were never loud, yet they stayed with me long after he passed away, especially during the moments when I felt myself trying to understand what he would have wanted me to do. My mom was different from him in ways that became clearer as I grew older. She leaned heavily toward certainty and familiarity, and she seemed to find both in the presence of my sister Mallory. When I look back, I can see how easily she drifted into patterns that favored the child who demanded the most attention rather than the one who tried to solve problems quietly. Mallory understood that dynamic early in life and learned how to position herself at the center of every conversation. Mom reacted to that energy with a blend of pride and protectiveness that created a line I rarely crossed, no matter how much I loved them both. When my father passed, the shift inside our home became unmistakable. Bills needed payment schedules required adjusting, and Mom needed support in a way she struggled to admit. I stepped into that space without hesitation, because I knew he would have wanted me to carry what I could. That choice led me to take the first job available to someone my age at the time, and I ended up working at a local supermarket to help keep our home steady. The work was exhausting at moments, yet it grounded me because it reminded me of what he valued. It also became the reason people around us began to categorize me as the dependable one, which contrasted sharply with how others viewed Mallory. My sister carried herself with a confidence that grew sharper after high school. She developed a taste for things that looked impressive, acted impressive, or allowed her to stand slightly above the people around her. The more she embraced that version of herself, the more she expected others to follow her lead without question. Mom responded to those expectations with encouragement that bordered on admiration. I watched their dynamic from the background and tried not to judge it, although it provided many moments where I felt the distance between us widening. The first time I met Brandon, my sister's fiancé, I understood immediately that he admired her more than she admired him. He introduced himself with a sincerity that felt rare, and there was something steady in the way he spoke that made me trust him faster than I expected. He seemed like the kind of person who tried to avoid conflict even when conflict gathered around him. Mallory interpreted that quality as permission to direct every detail of their relationship, and Brandon allowed it because he believed it created peace. Moments between them often resembled an unspoken script that depended on her control and his quiet acceptance. I sensed tension beneath their dynamic, yet I never imagined it would become as significant as it eventually turned out to be. Although our lives moved on separate tracks, the distance inside our family grew in ways none of us addressed directly. The responsibilities I took on shaped me into someone who valued structure. Mallory's choices shaped her into someone who valued perception. Mom continued to place her trust where it felt familiar. All of this seemed manageable until wedding plans appeared on the horizon and pushed our differences into a space none of us could ignore anymore. 3 weeks before the wedding, I walked into a family meeting that had already taken on attention I could feel before anyone spoke. Mallory sat at the end of the table with a posture that suggested she had been waiting to deliver something important, and she watched me with the kind of gaze that usually preceded one of her comments about how I presented myself. She glanced at my work clothes in a way that made her intention clear before she even opened her mouth. When she finally spoke, her tone carried a sharpness that cut through the room. "Can you wear something that doesn't look like you just clocked out?" She said it as if it were a practical suggestion. Yet her eyes made it clear she wanted to embarrass me. Mom reacted before I had a chance to respond. She leaned forward with an expression that signaled agreement, and her voice carried the same protective tone she always used when Mallory wanted something. She said, I needed to be more considerate because big events required people to look the part. The way she spoke made it seem like my presence created a problem they had to correct, and I felt the familiar pull of frustration that always appeared when the two of them aligned so easily. It reminded me of every childhood moment when Mallory's opinions were treated as facts, and mine were treated as optional. Brandon sat beside Mallory with a stiffness that told me he wanted to avoid the direction the conversation was heading. He tried to soften the atmosphere by mentioning that everyone had been busy, and that there was no reason to focus on outfits. His attempt to pull attention away from me was gentle, yet it also revealed how accustomed he had become to balancing Mallory's need for control with his desire to avoid conflict. I sensed that he wished the meeting would move on to something safer, although Mallory had no intention of letting it shift. Her voice gained an edge when she continued speaking. She said my job made it difficult for people to take our family seriously, and that she wanted the wedding to reflect everything she had worked for. The comment stung because it turned my efforts to help our household into a flaw she wanted to distance herself from. I thought about my father and the lessons he instilled in me about treating work with pride no matter what kind it was. He believed a person's character showed through the way they carried themselves, and I reminded myself that his view mattered more than Mallory's need to impress people she barely knew. I kept my voice steady when I responded, because I did not want the moment to spiral into something larger than it needed to be. I told her I would change before the rehearsal dinner, but that my job did not define the worth of our family. Mallory rolled her eyes in a way that communicated her refusal to consider anything I said. She insisted that appearances mattered because they shaped how people viewed important events. Her words created a heaviness in the room, and even Brandon looked away rather than meet her gaze. As the conversation shifted to wedding logistics, I noticed an undercurrent I had not paid attention to before. Mallory mentioned issues with a vendor, and Mom said something about an unexpected deposit. Their tones slipped for a moment, and I sensed a quiet disconnect between the plans Mallory wanted and the reality of what they could afford. The comments passed quickly because neither of them wanted to linger on the subject, yet they made something inside me take notice. I did not dwell on it at the time, although the thought settled deeper than I expected. The meeting ended with Mallory reminding everyone of her expectations, and I left with the awareness that my father's voice still guided me, even when the rest of the room felt determined to pull me in another direction. Later that week, I stayed late at the supermarket because the delivery shift ran over schedule and I needed the hours. I walked toward the employee parking lot while trying to plan how I would stretch my next paycheck far enough to cover groceries and the small contribution I had promised for Mom. I had almost reached my car when Brandon stepped out from behind a row of carts, with a hesitant expression that suggested he had rehearsed several openings before settling on silence. He took a careful breath and asked if I had a minute, and the uneasy way he shifted his weight made me understand that this was not a casual request. Brandon explained that he had hoped to keep everything steady until the wedding day, because Mallory expected a flawless celebration with no visible strain, yet several final invoices were overdue, and the planner was pushing for immediate confirmation. He said he had tried to manage all of it without bringing stress into their conversations, but his hours had been cut at work, and the savings he believed would carry them through had dissolved much faster than expected. He paused and admitted that he felt trapped between wanting to be honest and wanting to avoid another argument with my sister because she disliked hearing anything that did not match her plans. I listened as he described the pressure he felt to protect her excitement, which revealed more fear than pride, and the memory of my father surfaced with surprising force. Dad always said that responsibility becomes heavier when someone else's happiness depends on it, and that came back to me with unexpected clarity. Brandon looked ashamed when he asked if I knew any option that would help him stabilize the payments long enough to keep the wedding arrangements intact. The sincerity in his voice made it difficult to ignore the situation because he was not asking out of carelessness, but out of genuine worry. I told him I would cover the invoices and have them registered under my name until he found room to handle them himself. He looked startled and asked if I was sure, then thanked me with a relief that looked almost painful. I made the calls that evening, spoke with vendors who seemed more interested in fast confirmation than in who supplied the payment, and signed everything that needed to be cleared. Brandon said he would repay me, and I believed he meant it, although I also sensed he underestimated how much Mallory's expectations had expanded. When I returned to the store the next day, Chloe, one of Mallory's bridesmaids, spotted me as she walked toward her car with a glossy binder pressed to her chest. She gave me a once-over that carried enough judgment to make her intention unmistakable, and she asked with a bright smile that did not reach her eyes, "Are you even on the guest list?" The words struck harder than I expected because they were not shaped by confusion, but by deliberate amusement. She waited for a reaction, then flicked her hair and said she just wanted to confirm seating arrangements because Mallory wanted symmetry at every table. I did not answer because engaging would only encourage her. Instead, I reminded myself that helping with the wedding had nothing to do with gaining approval from people who never attempted to understand my choices. The memory of Dad's steady reassurance settled my thoughts, and I left without giving Chloe the reaction she hoped for. Her laughter followed me for a moment, yet it faded once I reached my car and focused on the fact that I had done what felt right, even if no one else recognized it. As the week ended, I sensed that the decisions I had made were only the beginning of a much larger shift, and I felt a quiet certainty that the surface calm surrounding the wedding would not last. The next afternoon felt strangely quiet in a way that settled into my thoughts as I tried to finish my shift. I had barely placed my phone back into my locker when it lit up with a notification that carried Mallory's name. I opened the message without hesitation because part of me still expected some attempt at reconciliation, or at least a practical question about the wedding preparations. Instead, the first line froze me in place. "You're banned from my wedding. I don't want anyone thinking my wedding looks like a discount sale." The words arrived with a confidence that revealed how long she must have waited for a moment to say something designed to cut deeper than anything before. Before I could react, Mom added a reaction to the message, a small gesture that carried enough weight to shift the ground beneath every assumption I had held about our relationship. Her agreement told me she had seen the message read its cruelty, understood its intention, and still chose to support Mallory without a moment of hesitation. I stared at the screen, aware that my breath had grown shallow as I tried to reconcile the reality that my own mother had not attempted to soften the blow or privately ask if I was all right. Another notification appeared, yet this one carried a different kind of finality. I had been removed from our family group chat. No explanation accompanied the action, and none was needed, because the silence spoke louder than any argument. My place in that circle had never been certain, and this small but powerful action confirmed everything that had lingered unspoken throughout the years. I sat for a moment with the phone resting in my hand, while the familiar ache of disappointment slowly grew into something far more resolute. I needed a moment to gather myself, so I stepped outside to clear my thoughts. When I finally checked my bank account, my chest tightened. Nearly $10,000 sat in pending transactions, all connected to deposits, catering assurances, vendor guarantees, and several additional fees that Brandon had been too embarrassed to discuss. Every payment carried my name because he had trusted me to help, yet I had never imagined that Mallory would turn around and humiliate me with such certainty, while relying so heavily on resources she assumed she would always control. Her message replayed itself in my mind, each word dredging up memories of every snide remark she had made about my job, every moment she dismissed the value of my effort, and every time she treated my support as something automatically owed. I remembered the family dinner where she laughed at my apron, the morning she joked about my schedule in front of friends, and the day she told Brandon that being associated with me lowered their image. Those moments had remained in the background for years, yet the accumulation now created a surge of clarity that felt almost physical. I understood that this situation no longer concerned a single wedding or a single insult. It represented a pattern that would never change unless I changed the way I allowed myself to be treated. My father had taught me that protecting my dignity mattered more than pleasing people who only valued convenience, and that lesson finally surfaced with full force as I watched the pending charges expand across the screen. I took a long breath and opened the payment management page. My fingers hovered for a second while I considered the weight of what I was about to do. Then I selected every transaction linked to the wedding and initiated the cancellations one by one. The confirmation emails arrived almost immediately, each one bringing a sense of release that spread through my chest like a long-delayed truth finally spoken. Mallory had wanted a wedding untouched by anything she associated with me, and in that moment I gave her exactly what she had demanded by removing the foundation she had been standing on, without gratitude. A few days later, my phone began filling with notifications that arrived in an uneven rhythm, each one carrying a tone that suggested something significant had shifted behind the scenes of the wedding planning. The first message came from the catering service, informing me that their contract had been canceled due to the withdrawal of the primary payment source. I barely finished reading it when two more emails surfaced from the venue coordinator and the photography team. Their messages followed the same pattern, each one confirming the cancellation of services, with a professional tone that did little to hide the disruption taking place. Even without seeing the reactions of the people involved, I understood immediately that Mallory's plans had run into an obstacle she never expected to face. About an hour later, my phone vibrated again, with a message from Mallory that carried an intensity she rarely tried to hide in private. I did not open it immediately because I could already sense the emotional storm building through the preview line that appeared above the screen. When I finally tapped it, the words spilled across the screen with a frantic energy. She demanded to know why every vendor had suddenly backed out and insisted that someone must have sabotaged her wedding preparations. She was convinced that no professional team would cancel without a compelling reason, and her panic threaded through each sentence in a way that contrasted sharply with her earlier arrogance. Before I could consider whether to respond, another message arrived, this time from Chloe. Her tone felt theatrical, as if she enjoyed being the messenger of the chaos. She wrote that Mallory was spiraling and insisted that the situation looked catastrophic. She claimed the wedding plans were collapsing and hinted that Brandon had reached a breaking point. Her message ended with a line that sounded almost triumphant, as if she had been waiting for a dramatic moment to reveal itself. An hour passed before I heard anything from Brandon. When he finally reached out, his voice cracked with exhaustion. He explained that Mallory had spent the entire morning directing her anger at him because she believed he should have fixed everything before the vendors reacted. He said she accused him of being unreliable and claimed he lacked the ambition necessary to support her vision. Their argument intensified until he finally told her, "You can't scream at me every time something doesn't go your way." His words only inflamed the situation because Mallory refused to accept any responsibility for the issues unraveling around her. Mom entered the situation shortly afterward, siding with Mallory without hesitation. Brandon explained that she had insisted he should have done more, although she had no idea about the financial structure behind the wedding. Mom relied entirely on Mallory's version of events and used it to justify a long series of criticisms that placed every ounce of blame on Brandon's shoulders. The tension in their house grew so severe that he stepped outside to breathe before calling me. I listened, but I did not offer explanations. My silence came from a place deeper than this moment because it held years of memories filled with quiet hurt and overlooked effort. Speaking now would only invite a storm that I had no obligation to stand in anymore. Brandon sensed my hesitation and did not press for answers, although I knew he suspected the truth lingered somewhere close. Later that evening, my cousin Tyler reached out with a screenshot from a different family group chat that still included him. The image captured a chaotic stream of messages from Mom Chloe and two aunts who tried to piece together what had happened. Some believed the vendors had made mistakes, while others insisted there must have been a misunderstanding. Through the confusion, one theme repeated: Mallory could not understand why everything was falling apart at once. Tyler warned me that the situation was escalating quickly and that the arguments had already spread across several family conversations. I thanked him and placed my phone on the table, letting the noise fade. For the first time in many years, I felt no need to defend myself or justify anything. The silence felt steady, not empty. The following week, the tension that had been hovering over everyone finally broke apart in a direction I never expected. Brandon asked to meet me outside a small coffee shop near my workplace, and the heaviness in his voice made it clear that something irreversible had happened. As soon as he sat down, he took a long breath and said he had ended the engagement. His decision did not come from the chaos with the wedding vendors, but from a deeper realization that Mallory treated every setback as a personal attack. He could no longer shoulder the emotional strain of being blamed for everything that went wrong in her life, and he refused to enter a marriage built on fear of her reactions. He explained that the last argument with Mallory had shattered any hope of balance between them. She had accused him of lacking ambition after he told her he needed time to process the wedding disaster. She insisted he owed her a perfect life and demanded he prove he could provide it without hesitation. When he said he needed space, she interpreted it as betrayal. He knew then that he could not promise her a future without losing himself entirely. I listened without interrupting because his resignation echoed something I had known for years. 2 days later, news about Mallory losing her job reached me through Tyler. She worked in an office where teamwork mattered, and her supervisor had finally acted after multiple complaints about her dismissive attitude. The chaos of her canceled wedding only intensified her temper at work, and after an incident with a coworker, she was asked to leave. Tyler relayed everything in a calm tone, yet I could sense the mixture of pity and exhaustion in his messages. While Mallory's life spiraled, Mom tried to steady it by calling every vendor she could reach. She offered to cover deposits and beg them to reinstate services, but most declined because the cancellation process had already gone too far. Mom even suggested taking out a personal loan to repair the situation. Hearing this from Tyler made my chest tighten, not from guilt, but from the familiar pattern of Mom rushing to shield Mallory from consequences while ignoring how deeply these choices affected everyone else. The confrontation with me came sooner than I expected. Instead of storming into my place or yelling over the phone, Mallory waited outside my building and stopped me as I returned home from a late shift. Her face was drained of its usual confidence, yet the entitlement in her voice remained untouched. She looked me straight in the eyes and said, "You can fix this. You owe me." The words were sharp and controlled, spoken like an order rather than a plea. There was no acknowledgement of what she had said about me, no recognition of the humiliation she had caused, only the assumption that I would step in and repair everything because I always had. I stood still for a moment, letting the weight of her expectations settle before I answered. I told her I would not restore the payments and that I no longer carried responsibility for the damage created by her choices. My voice did not rise, and I did not explain or justify myself. Mallory stared as if waiting for me to take it back, but I let the silence confirm I meant every word. Before she could respond, my Aunt Valerie arrived. She had planned to visit me that evening and walked into the scene just in time to hear the final exchange. Valerie stepped between us without hesitation and told Mallory to stop demanding what she had no right to claim. She said accountability was not cruelty and that I had given more than anyone had ever given back to me. Valerie's support grounded me, and for the first time Mallory realized the conversation was over. She left without another word, and the quiet she left behind felt like the closure I had waited for much longer than a week. Months later, life moved in a direction that felt steadier than anything I had known for years. I relocated to a different city after a position opened in a store owned by the same company, and the change gave me the fresh start I had needed, long before the chaos surrounding Mallory's wedding. The new neighborhood was quieter, and the distance created a welcome boundary that no one attempted to cross. I changed my work schedule a few weeks after settling in because I wanted a routine that reflected my own choices rather than a pattern built around other people's demands. I began working early shifts that allowed me to rebuild my personal life in the afternoons, and the sense of independence felt almost like learning to breathe again. Neither Mallory nor Mom contacted me during that time, and the silence did not sting the way it once would have. It simply confirmed that the space I had carved out was necessary. I stopped checking for their messages because I finally understood that peace can grow only when the loudest voices are no longer allowed to take root in your thoughts. The only person I kept close was my Aunt Valerie, who called every Friday evening. She never rehashed the past or asked whether I felt guilty. Instead, she asked about my goals, my day, or something small that had made me smile. Her presence was steady and uncomplicated, and it reminded me that family is defined by the people who show up with sincerity, rather than expectation. With time, the emotional noise that had once surrounded Mallory's collapse faded into something distant, and I no longer felt the need to revisit it. There were no reunions or attempts to fix what had never been healthy. I chose not to return to the city where everything had fallen apart, and I did not seek updates about how Mallory or Mom managed the aftermath. I learned to let the story end without forcing a final chapter. Some endings do not need confrontation, they simply require acceptance. The clarity that followed became the foundation of a new life built on boundaries I should have set long ago. I realized that boundaries are not walls meant to punish others, but commitments to protect the parts of yourself that have been neglected. Allowing people to mistreat you teaches them how far they can go, and choosing silence in the name of peace often creates deeper wounds. Walking away is not cruelty when staying would destroy your sense of worth. Healing begins when you decide that your dignity is non-negotiable. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. Stories like mine are not about revenge, but about reclaiming the space to grow without fear or guilt. If you have ever stepped back from someone you loved because you finally chose yourself, I would love to hear how you found your strength again. Share your thoughts and let's talk in the comments.